Уважаемые дамы и господа, our dear friends, we have, after we went into the spirit already yesterday to speak about the future of Eastern Europe without empire. We have now the first discussion that focuses on the main topic of this, and I want to invite on stage Mykhailo Minakov, Valeria Korablyova, Jerzy Pomianowski, and John Kyst. And Mykhailo, I leave it to you to speak about content.
1, 2, 3. You hear me? Okay,
yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, we're all set. We're all here. Good morning to everyone. Well, you know, at every conference, there are two bad panels, two bad timing for panels, in the morning and after lunch. And it's basically all day, no? But we have a privilege of waking you up and involving you into an important topic, which is connected with new temporalities and new geographies. We live in a world that changes very fast in terms of time and space. And today we shall talk about Eastern Europe, which is already a difficult notion, and then future, which always the worst topic to discuss, especially if you are empirically minded person. However, from pragmatic point of view, speaking about future is the most important thing, especially when it's the time of war. So it's not simply an academic issue, future of Eastern Europe. It's how to survive and what to do after. And I'm happy to discuss these issues with people who share different perspectives. So today in our panel, we have Valeria Korablyova, a person who I know for a long time and follow her publications for over a decade. She's a political theorist and cultural sociologist working on post-Soviet Ukraine and the region. She focuses on mass protests, nation building, colonial and imperial legacies in her publications. She is alumna and she holds a degree from Shevchenko University in Kyiv. And right now, here I have to read attentively, she heads the research center Ukraine in the Changing Europe at the Institute of International Studies at Charles University in Prague. Our second speaker today is John Kyst, who is a team leader in the Russian division of European External Action Service, so a person from Brussels. Dr. Kyst is one of those experts who analyze Russia's policy and who implements and communicates the EU approach to Russia, together with his colleagues in Brussels. And then I have a pleasure to talk today and present to you today Ambassador Jerzy Pomianowski, who is a Polish diplomat and European politician. Before the end of Cold War, he was part of democratic opposition, and then he made a career as a diplomat first, and a politician in the United Europe. Just to name his several positions, he was deputy foreign minister in Poland. He was director OECD UNDP Partnership for Democratic Governance, a very important initiative back in the time. And then he was Poland's ambassador to Japan. Now he is a founder and a long-serving executive director for European Endowment for Democracy. As you can see, we have diversity of speakers and diversity of perspectives, and I really hope that today we will discuss something meaningful, not only in academic terms, but in pragmatic terms. And I give the floor to Valeria first.
Good morning. Thank you, Mykhailo, for this kind introduction. I'm following your works very closely as well. Thank you, Jana, for this invitation. I'm honored to open this conversation today, especially in such a distinguished company, male company, I would say. So, the future of Eastern Europe without empire. I hate to be a party killer, but I need to make this statement that we have too many discussions after war, you know, like post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, the Davos discussion. What is happening after the empire or without empire? And as much as it is important to talk about those matters, and they send an important political signal, it's also a symptom of wishful thinking. I'm afraid when Blitzkrieg failed, we quickly, maybe too swiftly, moved from the declarations that Ukraine will fail to the belief that Russia will fail. However, we are not in the point where it is a given. Very far from that. So we should not underestimate the danger. We do have escalation in Ukraine and in other regions in the world, and the adversary is strong and cunning. So we need to start always thinking what we shall do to bring the empire to an end as soon as possible. That was kind of a manifesto statement, but then I will switch to the topic of today. And I think that we'll talk more about Eastern Europe later, and I would focus on the last part, without empire. So what does it mean to end the empire? And I see here several dimensions. The first is obvious, we talk about that a military defeat of Russia's attempts of a neo-imperial conquest is necessary. It's the first step, but not the only one. The second one, the quasi-imperial political design of the polity, which is a federation in name only, should be rectified. We cannot stop there yet. It is very much a domestic matter which requires some actions on the part of Russian citizenry. But the third one is equally important. We need to understand what are the roots of the Russia's appeal, imperial appeal, first and foremost in the West. Why, up till the full-scale invasion in February 2022, we, collectively, allowed Russia to define what was going on in its own terms while ignoring all other voices? Why did we accept the language of the sphere of influence, the Russian privilege to speak on behalf of others? And the fourth dimension, that we need to think seriously how to prevent any imperial revanchism in the future. And for that matter, we need to disclose the roots of this imperial appeal. And here I'm invoking a notion which I invented for the matter of this conversation, banal imperialism. There was a groundbreaking book published in 1995 by Michael Billig, which was called Banal Nationalism. And his main idea was that we're used to think that nationalism is something dangerous, archaic, and peripheral. That is something not inherent in us, but it's something like in faraway, underdeveloped countries. And he even gives the example of Moldova, Bosnia, and Ukraine, wonderfully. However, he argues that nationalism is here. It became so routinized that it went in the foundations that we barely notice it. When we see the flags, and he calls it like flagging of our landscape, we reproduce national sentiment, and we take it and we call it by other names. So we need to be very attentive and focused that we do have banal nationalism. But now I'm rereading Michael Billig's book with a fresh eye after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Suddenly I see how wonderfully fits all this description to imperialism. I'm afraid that we externalize imperialism thinking that it's a matter of the past. It's something that happened before, but we are done with that. I believe yesterday William Pomeranz said that we expected the age of empire to be over, far behind us. And now we are surprised that it is not. We do have a still standing, very aggressive empire, land empire in Europe, waging an aggressive war. So banal imperialism, what is it? How does it operate? Of course, we do not see many aggressive imperial wars around, but you do not necessarily have, Russia has just the caricature way for that, because it claims literally that Ukraine does not exist and tries to extinguish it physically. But what do other empires or the beholders of imperial mentality say? They say, oh, well, yes, you can exist, but you are small, you are unimportant, and you do not really have a say in the international debates. And this is also a manifestation of the imperial mindset. So, when I'm saying, when Russia's rhetoric lands well on certain ears in certain places, why? Because it invokes this residual imperial mentality, and it operates through two things: greatness and privilege. Every time when we are reconstructing the geopolitical hierarchies, when there are great powers and small nations, and maybe some rising middle powers, we are reinforcing this mentality. And certain sympathy for the Russian cause, even if not articulated, often is underpinned by this desire to retain privileges that are rooted in the imperial past. And I'm coming to my concluding point, that why do we need to deconstruct that? It's not only a moral stance. It's not only because we are sorry for Ukrainians being tortured and killed on a daily basis, on a massive scale. But I believe that a certain democratization of the international order, its reassemblement on a more just grounds, is a matter of survival of the humankind. I know it sounds like too much pathos and awfully naive. But Alexander Rodnyansky yesterday said, I used to be criminally naive. And I believe that in this situation, we cannot allow ourselves to be short-sightedly pragmatic. I'm afraid it's not pragmatic in the long run to stick to geopolitical realism. In the face of multiple dangers that we as a humankind are facing, rising social inequality, rising tensions everywhere, political turmoil, ecological disaster, which is somehow like sidelined, but it's still there. In the face of all those dangers, we're all small. There is no greatness in that. So we do need to change our mentality. We do need to be aware of this imperial residual thinking. Thank you.
Dear Jon, would you want to continue?
I will try. Do my best. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to come to this traditional forum, which is a very, very beneficial forum. Thank you, Zhanna, for the invitation, for what you do, what your team does. And thank you to the other speakers and the speakers yesterday and the speakers who will speak later today. It's really a privilege to be here. Indeed, I've come from Brussels. I work in the EU, in the EU's diplomatic service, in the Russia team there, working on support of Russian civil society as part of my what I'm charged with. I'll make a couple of statements and then I will go into a little bit of more of analysis as the panel here suggests. So, Russia acts as an imperialist power. Russia wants to take control of a country it believes belongs to its political sphere. Russia challenges the existence of a Soviet Ukraine, of a sovereign Ukraine in the name of an imperial or even neo-colonial vision. We know that Putin has dismissed Ukraine's identity and Ukraine's existence as a nation as a fake. And as long as Russia has not renounced this imperial vision, it represents a threat to world peace, which is what I hear you also saying, Valeria. Now, against the background of these observations about Russia and the vision of Russia as an imperialist power, let's turn to the title of our panel today, The Future of Eastern Europe, without empire. And as a philologist, I can't help thinking that that's not a sentence. The colon replaces the finite verb, and I ask myself if it means the future of Eastern Europe is without empire, or if it means the future of Eastern Europe should be without empire, or if the future of Eastern Europe will be without empire. So these modalities or temporalities, I think, leave the questions for us on this panel from the title. Now, to look for answers to these questions, whether they are more modal or they are more temporal, will Eastern Europe be without an empire, or should it be, or is it already? I think it will be useful to ask what can be in opposition, what can oppose empire. And I think here and it's good we're speaking English today, because there's a word which is very close to empire in English, which is empowerment, same first three letters, which I think is a good headline, empowerment, to the alternative that we in the European Union see to empire. So in this wartime, the European Union has an approach to Russia which starts and ends with Ukraine. We think about Ukraine when we wake up in the morning, we think about when we go to bed, and increasingly our Russia approach is a function in our Ukraine approach. And in that context, of course, empowering Ukraine is on the top of the agenda. The European Union supports and empowers Ukraine politically, financially, and militarily, with weapons, training of Ukrainian soldiers, with finance to survive and to finance the defense, and politically with the candidacy status that Ukraine received last summer and the ongoing dialogue on Ukraine's possible European future. That is empowerment of Ukraine. That empowerment also plays out in our relationship with Russian civil society and Russian independent media. Of course, there is a difference, and that difference is in the degree to which empowerment is, if you will, an abstract or concrete term. The empowerment of Ukraine is very concrete. A weapon is something concrete. A soldier who's being trained in Europe is something concrete. And it is, of course, slightly more abstract to talk about, or potentially more abstract to talk about the empowerment of democratic values and the support of those among those Russian voices that are in opposition to the war and in favor of democracy and against empire. But it can also be very concrete. The EU's empowerment of Russian civil society is concrete when we support Russian independent media and play a leading role in that, when we support Russian human rights defenders, when we invite and engage exiled or relocated Russians who are now in Europe or in our neighborhood to come to Brussels and to develop a relationship with us, with the European Union. These are examples of where I see and we see empowerment as an alternative to empire. My last point will be that this kind of empowerment is also one which we need as a union, as the European Union. We need to empower ourselves to be more resilient towards, for example, our dependency on Russian energy sources. We also need to empower ourselves and work on that, and have been working on that for a long time, to empower ourselves against Russian information manipulation and interference, disinformation campaigns. So empowerment is not only something that goes towards a beneficiary, be it Ukraine or the Russian civil society. It's also something that goes inwards to ourselves as our way of empowering as an alternative to neighboring an empire, or as a way of resistance and developing resilience towards a neighboring empire. And in that work, all that work, and that brings me back to the first words I said, we of course looked for examples of empowerment, of agency and resilience, which are the three words I think that come as alternatives to empire and that are powerful vis-a-vis empire. And the examples of resilience and empowerment and agency we see, for example, in the Ukrainian people. We see it also in the memory of Boris Nemtsov, whom we are here to also commemorate. We see it in the cases of Russian political prisoners, such as Vladimir Karamurza, whose mother I had the privilege and the honor of talking to yesterday. So Russian civil society also provides us with examples for developing this policy of empowerment, and thank you for that.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Ambassador.
Thanks a lot, and thank you, Jana, for inviting, and it's a pleasure to be. I was almost in every except one Nemtsov forum, so it's a great privilege to be with all of you here. And that's a very interesting topic for waking up the participants. It's definitely something that every Pole is happy to put a few thoughts into this discussion. As I was introduced, I'm coming from Poland, but the last 10 years I'm part of the so-called Brussels bubble. So I have maybe at least two different perspectives to this issue. Let me start with my home country perspective. Last time, and that comes for every country, sometimes in the history we feel like an empire. And last time Poland felt like an empire, it was in 1612, when we were actually 11, where we captured Moscow and we tried to install in Moscow Dmitry Samozvanets. Those who study history knows it well. There were actually 3 attempts to bring so-called legitimate ruler and with the military conquest, trying to put a friendly person on the Moscow throne. But just to take this historic lesson, I would say, strangely, at that time, we were not ready simply to take territory and say this is now Poland, but we were trying to install a Dmitry Samozvanets. So that means attempt was not to capture another country, but to make it friendly. So I would admire my predecessors in Poland way of understanding situation. Basically, to my view, if I can read their minds today, they said that this country is not manageable from Warsaw or from Krakow. So that means it has to be done differently. But that's for anecdotal approach to the history. What I would like to say today is that definitely what we see in today's Russia, Putin's so-called imperialism, I am reading this in a very simple format. It's just a cover for the weakness. It's just a cover for the weakness that he, more than anyone else, is aware. How much we will be telling that he lives in a bubble, that he does not understand what's going on. He understands, and I'm pretty sure he feels all the weaknesses of his own reign. So in my view, this whole concept of imperialism, of announcing that this is his objective, is a simple cover for the weakness. It brings some results because internally it provides a certain substitution for the lack of delivery, obviously, for the lack of respect for human life. I mean, for the sake of empire, what matters that 100,000 Russians are killed or another 100,000 Russians are killed? That doesn't really matter because there is something in the future to die for. This is a very simple cheat. But also it is a substitution for the lack of respect to people's needs, to have life in dignity, to have certain basic wealth to address all other concerns that we were talking here, like environment protection, living in a normal conditions in every sense, addressing some of the global challenges. All this is not important because imperialism justifies lack of respect for all those needs. And then finally, we can jump into sometimes a very temptational historical analysis. Some people may argue that when there were clear divisions between empires, then it was more or longer peace in the history of humankind. Nothing more illusionary, although some statistics may prove this concept. We need to understand that empires, of course, if they really exist and they are strong, and that's not the case of Russia today, are, of course, afraid of another empire. That's why if before they wage a war, they need to make sure that we are either strong enough or stupid enough to launch that type of competition. So these are the moments in the history that create an impression that there was a longer period of peace. And definitely empires or imperialistic minds are extremely sensitive to so-called gray zones, because that are the moments where they believe we have an easy prey to capture. And this obviously something that was a part of Central European policy after the fall of communism, where we were trying to explain to the international community that more gray zone, more frozen conflicts you leave and solved, more fuel you are providing for any kind of neo-imperialism. And that is, I would say, the concluding part of what I would like to start today with, that the only way is to mitigate imperialism. It's first not to leave any gray zone and any unsolved problem. That means membership in EU by Ukraine, membership in NATO by Ukraine, and also solving all frozen conflicts that are existing in Europe. That is the best way to mitigate any attempt of growth of Russian imperialism, with caveats to what I said at the beginning, that this is really not well-based imperialism. The imperialism only at the level of certain political agenda, but not at the strength of the structure that is behind this imperialistic political agenda.
Thank you very much. And well, let's be frank, what we just heard wasn't very much about future. It's very much about now. It's very symptomatic. And it's symptomatic for the periods which in philosophy of history we call caesura. It's the time when old continuities, tendencies end or are interrupted, and the new openings are possible. The new possibilities come up into the picture. The previous caesura was in 1989-91, and it really shaped the future of those times. I was a 19-year-old student of history at that moment in Zaporizhia, and I remember reading Komsomolska Pravda with short description of a document that actually made a future of Europe. It was the Chart of Paris of 1990. If you reread it today, you literally see that a number of Soviet and Western European politicians and intellectuals really came up with a picture that was almost fulfilled in the early 21st century. So basically, this Chart of Paris was talking about pan-European progress and the future where Europe is the the greater Europe, is the area where nations not only peacefully coexist, they cooperate and they share fundamental legal and political norms. Interestingly enough, that for me, Boris Nemtsov was an embodiment of that progress. I remember I met him in Orange Revolution times in Maidan, and I remember that he embodied energy, vital energy. If you ever met him or even looked at his interviews, you feel this energy. And that's the energy of progress of my generation, of those who came to politics, to society in the 90s. Wild 90s, but wild can also be a good thing, no? This caesura opened up for 4 big tendencies of the next 30 years. Democratization, nationalization. Democratization means building states that respect democracy and that are founded on democracies. Marketization, that was creation of open economies, which was a huge and important tendency. Nationalization, we were creating national states out of empire. So it was interesting that it wasn't empowerment per se as an anti-imperial, post-imperial alternative, but that was republic. And this national statehood of post-Soviet countries, it was about building vibrant republics, which had to choose whether it's going to be based on civic nationalism or ethnic nationalism, or ethno-lingua-confessional nationalism. And that was the dialectics of this process. But the 4th big tendency connected to the general progress of Europe, it was Europeanization. So creating this greater Europe from Dublin to Vladivostok. Now we live in a period in the new caesura that started in 22 with the launch of the war on my country and on my lands. I'm from Zaporizhia, and that's my identity, where the war is going on. And with this new caesura, what kind of future do we see, actually? So what new Paris Charter could we come up with? So what is the future of Europe that you, my colleagues, see, and what the role in this future would be for Eastern Europe? Let's move in the opposite direction. Jerzy? Yes.
Thanks. Well, I think to extend, the answer was already, in a sense, heard. That now there is only one way we can manage the complex security situation in Europe. And that's a difference from the time you try to quote. When you have an open war, when you have a situation that there is a front line, that the whole state machinery of still, let's call Russia empire, although as you've heard that I try to deny this capacity, or at least you have an imperialist state that has rather big military capacity. If you have this situation of the kinetic war and engagement of all systems, and on the other side, you have also full understanding of the situation, that is no more a gray zone, that is black and white and clear. There is less and less room for the international community, theoretically, to make mistakes, as we have made in the past, from Bucharest, from annexation of Crimea, and many other moments in the European history recently, where there was a total misjudgment of the dangerous threats and consequences of inaction. So at least from this point of view, I believe that there is no more room for such a mistakes. Am I right or wrong? Difficult to say today. But at least this is a belief. And this is what I would say a future that I believe in, that we will continue implementing certain policies without committing a similar mistake like in the past. To be seen.
Thank you. It is indeed difficult to talk about the future, especially when you come from political organizations. Political organizations tend to be to have agreed on policies that are quite strong on the present. But I'll risk and start out by reminding myself and us that often the best prognosis for the future is to look at today. And it's like with the weather, it's quite likely that tomorrow will be, tomorrow's weather will be like today. It would not surprise us if that happened. Now, which would be nice, right? Because it's a nice day outside in Berlin. This is to say that I think that we in the European Union, that the future of Europe is one where we will see the European Union doing what the European Union has always been good at, namely deepening and enlarging. So deepening the relationship and enlarging the Union. Every time the European Union has enlarged, it has, so many voices have said that it won't work, and it has worked. Think 2004. I am myself old enough to have been born just a couple of years before my country became a member of the European Union in 1973. I'm from Denmark. But I was also in Berlin in November '89 as a university student and saw the wall fall here. I lived in Leningrad in '91 when it became St. Petersburg and Russia became the Russian Federation. I was in your country, Mykhailo, in Ukraine already, and yours in '87 in Donbass, visiting Donetsk and Kharkiv and Mariupol, which was then called Zhdanov, as a high school student, etc. And when I think back of those times, you call it a caesura, which is a musical metaphor. But as I hinted before, I have a philological background, so it's also a colon. It is like it's the pause that the colon or the censura in music gives to say what will come next. It is an opening, and I think that back then the answer was what the European Union stands for, namely deepening relationship and building win-win relations, which brings me hope. It brings me hope because that is what I hope will bring Ukraine into the European family where it belongs, and it brings me the hope that the Russian democratic forces will see their hopes and dreams come true.
Yes, indeed, caesura. I think it's very exciting to live in historical times, which is like a popular version for caesura, right? Because when you see the history in the making, and that means that the future is open, and that means that multiple scenarios are possible, and we are enacting them both by our actions and inactions, right? And you seem to have been in the very right places, right? So that's quite exciting. So of course we do not know. Many people engage in futurology and give a list of various scenarios, and of course we can easily imagine that the negative one would be further fragmentation of the European Union and its weakening against the rising polities built on different grounds, in different design, values, and the way of coordination between elites and population at large. And the positive one would be deepening and broadening and empowerment. I do like this idea of empowerment as an alternative to imperialism. I think that the European Union is a very interesting story when its relative weakness today is the result of its success. So in a way it has delivered as what was promised, as Mykhailo said, but that story is exhausted. So now it is time to change something. Maybe not radically, but it is in the nature of the EU as a political institution and as a polity to develop through crisis. Every time when we say it's not working, we find a solution to refine certain things, to make them work better in the future. And this caesura, it's not only from music, but it's also from poetry. It sets the pace of reading, right? So it sets the rhythm of the development of the humankind. So how we will progress onward, how fast we will fall in the abyss or to the brighter future. So the question is open, but I want to comment on what Mykhailo said about these 4 dimensions. I think that the development of the EU so far has been over-focused on institution building. It was very much about institutions, regulations, procedures, and so on and so forth. And it delivered. It delivered the promise of peace and prosperity. But then it missed something systematically. It missed the role of emotions, political emotions that can be mobilized differently. And it missed the spontaneity of political agency, popping up here and there. So we are de facto living in an increasingly turbulent world. And Joseph Nye says that now geopolitics is like a 3-dimensional chess game. Then you need to play vertically and horizontally, because it's not only about states or super-states institutions, but it's also about non-state actors, gray zones, civic actors, guerrilla agents. So too much of factors that potentially influence the outcome. And we need to account for that, so that it's not only about institutions. This is not to say that they're not important, but it's not only about institutions. So we need to engage with agencies and empower them if they are somehow synchronous in our visions for the future. And probably the last point I would mention here, that I come across people in the EU believing in this narrative that prosperity brings peace. But in fact, it is the opposite. Peace brought prosperity in the European Union. And in order to live in a tentatively prosperous world, we need to restore peace, because otherwise we will be investing funds in weapons, in military development, in whatever, but not in the peaceful, normal life, which should be a guiding line for Europe, which is, by the way, I need to say that not an imperial, neither imperial nor quasi-imperial project, irrespective of what Front National in France, Marine Le Pen says, and other right-wing players. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you probably saw that panelists avoid to be prophets, and you noticed this again. Well, I have even more questions now to them, but I'll fight my egoism and offer you to ask questions. We'll collect first 3 or 5 questions, and then we'll have a possibility to hear the answers. 1, can we? 1, 2. I'll bring you this. Oh, you have it. Okay, here we have. Yes. Yeah, I also have 2. We have abundance of those. Okay, maybe this one will work.
1, 2.
Yeah, it does. So, once again.
Hey, hello. My name is Nikita. I'm a political scientist and political journalist. So I have several questions actually about certain actions of the European Union. As you have mentioned, we should foresee a certain enlargement of the European Union. However, I have heard a lot of heated debates on this topic, because last enlargement of European Union was Romania and Bulgaria, which is considered a huge failure for European Union, and which brought a certain enlargement fatigue into European political discourse. Also, we have a case of the Western Balkans and ex-Yugoslavia, where a lot of mistakes occurred, I would say, and Serbia and Montenegro now for decades are candidates and not members. How to avoid with Eastern Europe these mistakes which took place in Yugoslavian scenario? And does it mean that if we enlarge to the Eastern Europe, we should as well consider enlargement to the West-Eastern Europe, Balkans? Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. There was a colleague near you. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Kristina Shenok, Office of Belarus Democratic Forces in the Czech Republic. As I'm a Belarusian voice here, my question will be related to Belarus. How do panelists estimate the probability if Russia fails, and we hope that Russia fails in Ukraine, and we believe in Ukrainian victory? The consolation prize for Russia will be Belarus. Do you think this is a realistic scenario or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, gentlemen. We have a very active corner. Any other activities around the...
That's a rather active wing, well, proud to be part of it. Hello, my name is Miron, also another Belarusian voice from this side of the wing, but having studied for the last 2 years in Armenia and seeing now the very, well, to use a very cynical term, which pains me, but a very unfortunate resolution or outcome of the crisis in Karabakh, I would like to ask you, dear panelists, on what's the vision for this future European Union, future Paris Charter for the bordering regions with Europe? Because as we witnessed, their security and their stability is also crucial, but what shall be the strategy of future Europe for example, Caucasus, which cannot, or can it be included in the whole pan-European project, or can be associated with it? What's the vision? Is there a role that a future Europe can take, and how do you see the significance of that region and of the bordering regions with Europe for its new security and for not leaving any gray zones or unresolved conflicts? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we had 3. I will add 1, and then we can start answers. Well, you probably remember that in 1990s there was such a term, the last dictatorship of Europe. Do you remember what was the country? Well, actually, it's turned out that it was the first post-Soviet dictatorship that started the trend. And then later we saw that in the post-Soviet period, the majority of post-Soviet recognized states and all non-recognized states were actually dictatorships. Well, different level of authoritarianism and autocracy, let's put it this way. Now, we're talking about post-imperial Eastern Europe, but is it really post-imperial? Maybe it's pre-imperial. What's your guts are saying? Come on, I try to force you to speak about future. Thank you. Valeria, we'll start with you.
I'm always struggling with answering those questions seriously because we imagine that the war in Ukraine is like the Russian war in Ukraine, I should be saying. When it ends, everything supposedly will go back to normalcy. So all these questions are prefigured with the idea that all the other places in Europe and institutions will be intact, which is barely the case. So a lot depends on the exact outcome of war. Who wins, with what price, and what would be the conditions. And that would have reverberations for many, many corners of the world to a certain extent. And all the questions about Belarus, whether it will be a consolation prize, it very much depends on what will happen in Russia and what would be the cost of defeat in Russia. So it's very probable that the turmoil that can be going there will leave just like Belarus on the sideline of attention, right? So they will be too busy with something else, and that would be the window of opportunity and hope for the Belarusian opposition. And the same applies with Armenia in a different way. So we do not know what would be the powers in different places on the rise and on decline. What would be the architecture, the security architecture, where we will need then to find a place. I mean, I do understand the human desire to go back to normalcy, to externalize because like war is a horrific challenge, for psychological challenge as well. So we do want to restore normalcy. We do want to have scenarios for the future, but too many variables that cannot be seriously accounted for. And Nikita's question about enlargement fatigue. There is this tendency in the EU to blame peripheries for whatever goes wrong. So we have this EU polycrisis, And every time something goes wrong, they say, oh, it's Greece's fault. Oh, Bulgaria and Romania were too weak economically and politically. That's why they're failing. They are not like pure, full-fledged EU member states. But maybe the entire design was not modified to incorporate them successfully. And I'm talking here about the institutional design, but also very much about the sentiment. Since we are talking about Eastern Europe, I see there, and by Eastern Europe I mean all the lands to the east from the core Europe proper, which includes Visegrad countries. And what I see there is a huge resentment about being othered, being like not fully European, sort of second-rate citizens. And then you have the democratic backlash. And then you have them imagining different configurations where they will be the center, even if of a smaller symbolic entity. So my point is, and I see, by the way, hopes in the region, in Poland and Baltic states, we have been warning about the Russian threat for a while now. We were ignored as aggressive nationalists, like having lost touch with reality. Now the reality proved that we were right and you were wrong. So maybe in the future, we will have a say. You will be listening to us more carefully. So there is the expectation of changing power balances inside the EU. And it makes sense. So if you are integrating EU members, if you want to enlarge and deepen, then you need to modify the structure to make it more horizontal and more inclusive in a way.
Thank you. I'm not going to be very concrete. I'll start off by saying now in my answers. And the reason is that once we start asking specific questions to specific future scenarios, when there is no political decision about it, I don't have a mandate to speak. So I'm very, very happy to be speaking after Valeria, who so eloquently and accurately in her analysis described some of the main sort of focuses on the future. I will say start out by saying that again, going back to allow myself to quote myself, going back to this idea about the weather tomorrow likely being, you know, with some probability like it was today. That to counter the narrative of enlargement fatigue or too big enlargement, but also to answer the question about that asked, you know, what geographies would be coupled with which in a possible future enlargement scenario. Let's remember that the 2004 scenario was a big, or enlargement was a big enlargement, and that it is like, you know, these things happen, and they've happened before. You can also have pre-fatigue. You can say in the pessimistic narratives about saying the EU is unable to swallow this or and then it works out, like you said with the latest or with the enlargement with the member states that were mentioned. It happened, and they are fully fledged members of the Union today. I think when very generally speaking, which I have to speak very generally, when we look eastwards, and then the panel today has geography in its name, so we have to focus eastwards. And I want to echo what Valeria said about the ability of the European Union in very general terms to internalize and accept discourses that criticize empire, which is the problem the European Union had for so many years, not to listen enough to those member states who had the concrete experience of empire. As someone who works on Russia policy in Brussels, I'm very often asked about one of the most sensitive questions. That's why people ask it, namely, how is it about the member states who own the European Union? Is it true that some of them are very soft on Russia and some are very tough on Russia? And how do you live with that in the sort of middle of that? How do you find a stable position in that? And my counter answer is often to say that maybe the metaphor of tough and soft is not the most productive one. Maybe it's concrete and abstract that is a better metaphor. Member states, some of the EU member states forcefully became a part of the Soviet Union. Others lost sovereignty to the Soviet Union, became victims of empire in the post-World War II Europe, they have a concrete experience which they bring to the table. Others have more abstract experience because their bodies and their nations have not have not faced the violence of empire, and that shapes their perceptions. It gives some of them, the abstract, some opportunities to dream more, and maybe in some situations to have other ways of thinking and developing a policy, which means that it is not necessarily wrong to be abstract, but it does give you an authority to be concrete. An authority which, in the case of the more Eastern member states, the Central European member states, and the Baltic member states, was not to sufficient degree accepted in Brussels. And President von der Leyen made a very, very strong statement on that in her State of the Union speech last year, where she fundamentally said that this was wrong, so I think so my point here will be, to whatever the future enlargement, etc., will bring, there will be because history has taught us that now, a more inclusive approach to the thinking, which will take more into account than was the case earlier, the voices from the EU's own East, even if we don't define it as Eastern Europe.
Well, let me say first about enlargement fatigue. As much as we would spend time explaining what it is, I would simply ignore it. Because the European Union is such an entity that if you go, and sorry for bringing back this unfortunate referendum that took place in Netherlands about Ukraine, if you go to the people living in peace and wealth and you ask them a simple question, do you want more problems or less problems? The result of referendum is known. So what is the fatigue? The people simply don't want to have problems. But that's not an answer, and so far in the recent history, we proved within EU that although the general feeling is to have less problems, we are entering into new engagements and new problems, because this is also the nature of the core philosophy that has created the European Union. That means it's an organization not to build the walls, but to build the gates, to open, to have a kind of inclusive approach. And of course, all the time we will hear people close the door, build the wall, but that will not work. So from the point of view of, I would say, institutional philosophy and political philosophy behind, there will be no danger of the real fatigue, but there will be a temporary moment of so-called fatigue, as I gave this example of the referendum. And here we need to say something, although I am not a researcher and I am not a politician per se, but something very philosophical. European Union is the concept that requires to believe in. It does not only require us to be part of or to simply enjoy it, but also to believe in, because it is a political, philosophical concept that simply says, and it was said long ago, that it is possible to find a solution to mitigate different interests and even conflicting interests in a smart, peaceful, and not endangering anyone manner. And that is the whole promise of EU. If, and the moment EU is not able to deliver on that promise, it will disappear. Simply disappear, because this is a founding concept, founding belief. So I'm not saying that EU is religion, far from this, but there is an element of certain belief at the core, at the foundation of it. And this is something has to be understood, especially what Valeria rightly said, that there are so many chess, I would say, boards in parallel played. And one of those boards is people's emotions. That is not related to their wealth, but related to many other factors that are accompanying their life. So if we, in the future, inside EU and those newcomers, we will be not enough emotional about our belief in this setup, it will disappear. And it will really be harmful. So in that sense, how much inside EU we believe this is a bureaucratic institutional setup, I would always say it is equally emotional, political, and philosophical setup. And both of them, as long as they go together, there is a future. There is a future for enlargement. There is a future for solving problems. And similarly, like in every country own system, democracy, why democracy is better than anything else. And we know those famous sayings. Not because this is the problem, this is the system that addresses all needs, all problems, but this is a system that is able to self-cure, that is able to manage conflict in such a way that is not destructive to the society and to the country. And as long as democracy can deliver on this promise of solving problems, but and that exists, when it's not able, that means something really wrong, and then we have either authoritarianism, dictatorship, fascism, and all kind of diseases from the history we know very well. So similarly to the European Union, I am sure it will enlarge. I am sure it will find a way to solve more and more problems, and I am also sure it will commit many more mistakes that committed in the past. And that's going to be a painful process.
Thank you very much. Well, we have another opportunity to collect some questions. Yes, please. Lady in the second row, please.
Yes, hello. Barbara Freitag from the Prague Civil Society Center. My question comes back to the concept of gray zones, because it is too often linked in a very simple way to these frozen conflicts. And what has happened in Armenia might give us the illusion that we are entering a new era where this is the end of frozen conflicts, because in the fog of war, they are simply dissolving. But our observation is that instead of frozen conflicts, we have quite a threatening development in the gray zones, which make them turn into grayer gray or blacker gray. And we have other means than frozen conflicts, which I think systemically we have had a tendency to ignore. We have military bases, Russian military bases in a big majority of the post-Soviet states. We have a capture of the political elites, and I think I only need to point to Georgia to see that we have the threat of a capture of a whole country. And I think we are still not prepared enough in Europe for looking close. Having the focus on Ukraine, Ukraine is still the exception in really fending off and fighting back against the imperial threat. Other countries are succumbing, Kyrgyzstan being the last example of introducing NGO legislation just like Russia's. And I think we have to be very, very sober when it comes to what is happening in the post-Soviet sort of mega gray zone that we have to deal with.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, gentlemen. Finally, this side of the room is waking up.
Thank you. My name is Anton Antic, and I represent a group of IT entrepreneurs and venture investors coming from the Russian side. And I have a comment / question to this group. So basically, before the war, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, they were all in our sector friends, right? So IT was done together. There is a lot of companies that were doing global startups and technology. And I believe this represents also a big opportunity for European Union itself. Because I think everybody saw the piece in Financial Times about a month ago, which said that in 2008, the GDP of the European Union was on par with the US, but then there was a huge gap. The US is now much faster growing and much larger. And to a large extent, this is thanks to the software and IT and venture capital. And what we see being inside Europe is that this part is sort of oftentimes overlooked, but at the same time integrating the new blood, such as Ukrainian IT sector and even Belarusian and Russian people who came from out of Russia and are building companies right now all over Europe, that would help Europe as well. So my question to you is whether this is being considered or are there any thoughts on this topic? But in any case, we're also open to this dialogue, and there is a group of people who are willing to talk. We have lots of companies, we have resources, and we would like to sort of start working together and exploring this idea as well. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question? Yes, please.
Hello to all. Alexis Prokopiev from Russie Liberté, Paris-based NGO. First, maybe a short remark on Romania and Bulgaria. I think there is no consensus about the failure of the accession to the EU of Romania and Bulgaria. If you saw these countries before the accession to EU and if you go there today, I think you'll see a huge difference. My question is about Ukraine and about the occupied territories. Of course, we all wish and we all work for the victory of Ukraine, and we hope that the territories occupied, illegally occupied by Putin's regime will be liberated really soon. I have a concrete question. What do you think should be concretely done today in the European Union and maybe also in Ukraine to help the transition period? I'm not talking only about the military forces, of course, the military help, which is very important, but I'm talking also about the empowerment, about the trainings, education systems, because of course there will need to be a transition period in this occupied territories when it will be liberated. So what should be done concretely to train, to help people, to Ukrainians, to of course make this transition period a successful period? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will finish with this. I'll add one more question, and this is like the last opportunity to say something out. And my question is connected. Well, did you notice that today we were talking here and over there in the audience about Europe as if Europe is equal to European Union? But again, I mentioned Chart of Paris, and it was not the case. Even more, the guiding force, the institution of Europeanization in these 30 years was probably Council of Europe. So is there any role in future of Europe for Council of Europe? This is what I would add. Thank you. Jerzy, would you please start?
Yes, that's a nice question to me because I was the chief organizer of the third summit of the Council of Europe in 2005 in Warsaw. Yes, the Council of Europe role in Europe is close to my heart and my personal biography, because the role of the chief organizer was to set up the meeting itself and also to be once a week for about 6 months to chair a drafting committee in Strasbourg for the declaration of the summit. Recently we had a fourth summit of the Council of Europe that took place in Reykjavik in Iceland. So the third summit is already forgotten. But at that time we drafted about 2 pages document. It took a drafting committee to draft it, like, as I said, 7 months. A lot of work to draft few words. Already at that time, 2005, the most difficult partner at the table for the drafting was Russia. Actually, we are still active and welcome member of at the table. But why I'm saying it, I'm simply saying that the type of organization like Council of Europe works when you have around the table partners that are united through some kind of objective. And what we see today, for example, in OSCE, the organization is paralyzed because the original concept of so-called round table is no more working. And that's exactly what I meant when I was saying, once you have a kinetic war on the continent, all those mechanisms that are based on so-called goodwill assumption are very ineffective. And that is, unfortunately, the situation of today. So we have to try to use those instruments as much as we can, because they do exist. But we should not put too much, at this moment specifically, expectations, because they need to rebuild themselves in this new specific situation. Coming back to the few other answers or questions, especially it was raised by Barbara Freitag, I think it is a very right point to say that the frozen conflicts are not over and will be not over in the near future. And I would add to it a warning signal that actually the biggest frozen conflict ahead of us is any kind of dirty peace in Ukraine. So if there is no real victory, if for one reason or another Ukraine is forced to accept some kind of strange arrangements that will keep a kind of front line where it is now, or moved a few kilometers back and there, that's going to be disaster for next 50 years in Europe. And that's going to be the biggest frozen conflict and the biggest mistake that what I was referring to when I was saying that European Union will commit many mistakes in its own future, because that's the nature of this organization. But I'm also referring to the whole international democratic community, that they should be warned about this type of so-called arrangements. That is the huge, for me, real danger that should be by all means avoided. The second point was about capture of political elites and others. Let me quickly comment this with an anecdotal situation that happened when I was visiting Yerevan just before setting up that time new government of Nikol Pashinyan. As you could remember, there was an element of revolution, of the very positive atmosphere. Many people from the civil society joined Pashinyan administration. Some of them joined the parliament. And I had a meeting, a dinner with several of them that were former grantees of EED, and we had a discussion. And during this discussion, 2 or 3 times a similar message came that I felt like this is their message to me. They said, like, Jerzy, we are so proud that our revolution is not geopolitical. We are making democratic Armenia without need for making choice whether with Russia or without Russia, because democracy does not need to make these choices, because we have some important friendships, and we can be friends of Europe and we can be friends of Russia. Well, I waited until dessert and this dinner, and then I said, yeah, but I remember you were very much against corruption. Of course, and with the new government you will try to fight corruption. Of course. Well, from that moment you are geopolitical. Because the nature of what Barbara means capturing elite, the nature of the type of influence that Russia is making, and the part of its toolbox is corrupt schemes, is mafia, is a certain type of oligarchs connected to Moscow, and they are providing this extra control over the system. It's not about formal interstate agreements. It's about those informal, extremely toxic type of relationships and links. So the moment you set up in your own country that is in this region a strong anti-corruption agenda, like it was, for example, in Ukraine, from that very moment you are becoming geopolitical and you are becoming enemy of Moscow. So that is an important, I would say, aspect of what we would like to say about whole so-called gray zone. If we able to convince those societies that they have chance to live in a more normal way, and we don't tell them hate Moscow, just hate corruption, that would be good enough strategy to change the whole situation in the region for better. And the final, I would say that about IT friends, that is a very interesting point of view you made. That there is a lot of I would say, interaction between IT community from Ukraine, from Belarus, also from Russia. But at the same time, we have to remember that also IT community in Russia is part of the Russian so-called imperial toolbox. I'm talking about troll factories, I'm talking about hacking different websites. So in a sense, by simply being a member of this community does not necessarily mean that you have heart on the right side or good side of the story. So that has to be a very clearly, I would say, part of the internal culture between setting up different cooperations platform to make sure that you are working among good people. And then probably you can move mountains, because there's a huge capacity out there.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief. Agreeing, I just want to start out by supporting Jerzy's points about corrupt elites and Barbara's original question about the concern of regarding so-called gray zones and frozen conflicts. Yes, I think the warning to that what you called a dirty peace in Ukraine is certainly something that we should look at. We should be aware of and think about. The peace formula of President Zelensky is, in the opinion of the European Union, the only viable solution to a peace in Ukraine. Let me stress that. And also following up on your point about anti-corruption, indeed, it is a very good point that the kind of empowerment that comes in the fight against corruption is an empowerment that makes some colleagues have been talking about the emotional level, but makes maybe the emotion that could be labeled anti-Russian sentiments, makes it concrete. Again, instead of the abstraction of saying, of course, in wartime, much more understandable in an understandable different way, but still making it concrete by saying let's fight corruption. The European Union's program for fighting corruption in Ukraine is, of course, at the heart of the EU's work in Ukraine. On IT, I also share the point that let me stress that the European Union is very interested in focusing also on the parts of Russian civil society that is not activist but more knowledge producing. So somewhere between NGOs and the IT community, you find academia, you find scholars and students, which is on our radar very much. A lot of Russian scholars and academics have also either been forced to leave the country or chosen for moral and political reasons to leave their country, and they need to be helped in the EU, and we are looking very much at doing that. On the question about French colleague on the transition in occupied territories in Ukraine, this is of course very much a political question that's up to the government in Kiev to decide on and how it's going to be done. Let me only stress in very general terms that the EU stands with Ukraine for as long as it takes, and when this formula we say for as long as it takes is often being questioned and criticized, but I think it's a good formula because it can also, long also means beyond the end of the war on the other side, be it in the membership perspective or in the kind of support that we'll need to look at what happens in what will happen in the, by that time, deoccupied territories. Finally, of course, thanks for the question that again on what is Europe, which again in sort of takes us into the philosophical or even linguistic problem of denotation here. Yes, we often asked, of course, the lingo in Brussels is that when we say Europe, we can also mean the EU, but the EU can also mean different things. It can mean the 27 member states and their territory, it can mean the institutions, it can mean the idea, the treaty. I think that mentioning in that regard also the multilateral fora that were mentioned here, be it the Council of Europe or OSCE, is important. They are also Europe, or answers to the philosophical question what Europe is, and it's also correct, as Jerzy points out, that in times of war, institutions that are built to prevent war become different. That being said, the European Union was also created to prevent war. That is the starting point of the European Union is to prevent World War II to happen again, and the EU continues to function. And in the case of the Council of Europe, yes, Russia has forced to leave. That is also a war situation, but the return to multilateralism in Europe that will inevitably come will be one where we will, which will also give us an opportunity to talk to the hopefully democratic post-war Russian government.
Thank you for my wonderful colleagues for making brilliant points, so I need to skip many of what I plan to say. I would probably start in the opposite order about the deoccupation of Ukraine. I see two main points. The first one, that Ukraine must not get off the radar, because the media attention would be shifted elsewhere, like, okay, we achieved victory, done. Now, and then like people just stop talking about it, and many promises were made, but not like really implemented. So that would be like a disaster, because so many things need to be done in Ukraine, and I think there is no single citizen of Ukraine who does not have the post-traumatic syndrome, let alone infrastructural and education and all of that matters, which requires a lot of financial capital, human capital, multiple resources from multiple agencies and donors. So everything is very much welcome. But for that to be realized, we need to keep Ukraine in focus. So I hope it will be there. And the second point is that international institutions should hopefully learn the lesson from the past, because on the very first day of the invasion, international institutions that were designed to attend to humanitarian needs of people retreated from the territory, leaving their local employees behind, and then leaving to local people to tackle urgent needs of various kinds. So I hope that that would be also, that some lessons will be learned how to prevent it from happening again. Now about the IT. Of course, I welcome the idea of developing the IT sector in the EU economy and outsourcing all sorts of specialists, as well as I very much welcome going out of national bubble and meeting somewhere. However, I'm not sure that the configuration that it should be the cluster Russia, Belarus, Ukraine is a viable one in any foreseeable future for a number of reasons. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's not about any sort of ethnic hatred, but it's about the fact that our experiences and our agendas become more and more divergent. And that clustering that existed before was very much because people did not find a place for their identity on mental maps of European and Westerners, so to speak, what is to be Ukrainian or Belarusian. I hope that will change too. And the most challenging question, but a very useful remark by Barbara, what you are saying is indeed there. And I think what What is challenged nowadays is our belief in progress, which is very much still ingrained in the European mentality. We still believe that everything will be good. It cannot get worse. If something goes wrong, it's a deviation, but then we are back on track. And then we constantly keep being surprised when we say, oh no, the war is on a large scale, the war is impossible in the 21st century. All these sorts of musings, they prevent us from seeing the reality for what it is. And we keep thinking, and when we have been observing Russia, we were talking about that even if it is authoritarian, it's a very specific postmodernist hybrid. We'll be talking about spin dictatorship later today, right? So this like very specific but sort of, refined and still progressive authoritarianism, not old school totalitarianism. But then we see a pretty creepy comeback of some Stalinist measures being employed today, occasionally and intermittently, but we do not know where it goes. And that makes a link to what Mykhailo was saying, that maybe Lukashenko was not the last dictator of Europe, but a harbinger of changes to come. So we should, and I'm not saying that we should be pessimistic, but we should be well aware that it can go in either direction. And it can get worse in many places. And if we were happy with these gray zones arrangements, like trying to look away from them, we did not believe that that would be like some tension and some intensification of violent conflicts there, but it's happening. And the capture, so whatever, like everything you have described to us so aptly, it is the situation when it goes wrong and it can go even worse, and we must be aware of that. And I would probably conclude with this reasoning, so because we are very much focused on the EU somehow in this discussion. The fantastic point made by Jerzy, when you're asking people, do you want more problem or less problem? And people say, yes, of course we have less problem. But I'm asking myself, whose job it is to reframe the question and to say, are we ready to tackle problems now as long as they are manageable? Or do we want to look away and to wait for them to grow to the extent that they are unmanageable? And if we reframe the question, then maybe the answer would be different, so I hope for that.
Thank you very much. Well, look, we spent together 90 minutes. It's over 100 persons right now in the hall, which means we invested a huge number of working hours of social time into being here together. And it would be a nasty result if we would leave without some lessons. I took a liberty and I wrote down some wisdoms that were announced or asked or commented today. So before we leave, I'll just read and ask you to reflect it a little bit further. So, it is not only nationalism that is banal. Imperialism can also be banal. More just international order is necessary, and naivety of this aim is not an argument against it. Empowerment instead of imperialism. EU needs to empower itself to be more resilient to negative influences, negative influences of the empire in the neighborhood. Putin's regime is fragile and it is aware of it. And Putinism does not have capacity to fulfill the imperialist project. To mitigate imperialism in future, we should not leave any normative gray zones where it can regrow. Europe as a project is good at deepening and enlarging. Peace made united Europe possible. For Europe to continue, we need to bring this peace back. Europe is a political religion. Gray zone can become black zone. Goodwill assumption doesn't work anymore in European context. And finally, the question, will the end of war bring Europe to some normalcy? Thank you very much, and let's thank our speakers today.
Thank you, speakers, and also thank, of course, Mykhailo for the wonderful moderation, because you opened lots of thoughts that are also related to the fact that in Germany and huge parts of Europe, people speak about a Zeitenwende, and that there was a wake-up call and everything is different, but we realize more and more that it's not fully there yet. So there is these wake-up calls that you summarized that are still there. And for you in the room to wake up fully, there is coffee outside. You're invited. We start back at 12. Thank you so much.
Thank you.